1950, 88% of America was white. 2050, by U.S. Census projections, 44%. From 88% to 44%.
Literally halved.
Such that today's Gen Z and Alpha, if they come in a group and it is not racially diverse, their antenna immediately go up and say, what's the matter with this place?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, I'm so glad you joined us today. If you have ever wondered what happens as Christians become the minority in the U.S., what shifts do you need to make your church future ready, and the surprising reasons people give for not attending church, you've come to the right place. Today, I've got Warren Bird and Adelle Banks on the podcast, and we're going to talk about all that and a whole lot more. You can like, subscribe, and leave a comment to join the conversation. We're going to jump right into the interview after a word from our very carefully chosen partners, and then right into the conversation. Today's episode is brought to you by StudioC. You know, every pastor wants to disciple people effectively, but here's a real challenge. How do you do it at scale without losing the personal touch? Well, churches like Church of the Highlands, Saddleback, Rock City, and others are doing it with StudioC's member engagement solution, and the results are impressive. So imagine automatically knowing who needs encouragement to join a group, who's ready to serve, and who might be considering baptism. These leading churches are using StudioC to deliver personalized messages that move people forward in their faith journey. After all, if discipleship is your why, personal engagement is your how. So if you're ready to join these forward-thinking churches, start by taking StudioC's member engagement assessment to see how you can engage your people better at scale. Take the free assessment today at thestudioc.org/Carey. That's thestudioc.org/Carey. Today's episode is brought to you by Belay. So what is one task you wish you could delegate today? The truth is, just because it has to get done doesn't mean you have to be the one to do it. So stop doing it all and start delegating with Belay. I just delegated a problem I had the other day to my assistant. I'll tell you, it makes a huge difference. Frees up your mental load. And for over a decade, Belay has matched busy leaders like you with the support they need to start delegating. Whether it's a virtual assistant to knock out your to-do list or an accounting professional to handle your finances, Belay's flexible staffing solutions have your right hire right now. So to get started, download Belay's free guide to delegation today, 25 Things to Stop Doing in 2025. With this resource, you can declutter your to-do list, delegate to someone you trust, and reclaim your time and focus today. Here's what you do. Text my name, Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, to 55123 for your free download. That's C-A-R-E-Y to 55123. And in no time, you'll be off doing exactly what you do best. Well, hey, leaders, before we jump into today's conversation with Warren Bird and Adelle Banks, I've got David Kinnaman here, CEO of the Barna Group, and we are going to talk about a State of the Church update. And today, David, I want to ask you about the state of church engagement. You've got some new research, and we want to share it with leaders because as we learn, we all grow together. So what are you discovering about engagement?
Well, I've heard you say before, Carey, that engagement is the new attendance and a great way to measure an effectiveness in ministry. And we have done a study among pastors asking them a very similar question. And we asked them to choose between two different options. We asked them, of the two statements, which comes closer to what you believe? And the first was attendance and size are a good metric for measuring the success of a church versus number two, depth of engagement and commitment are a good metric for measuring the success of a church. Now, in our surveys, I sort of said number one, number two, but we always rotate randomly the ways in which those are presented. So it's
right, in case people have a bias toward like, well, I always do the first answer. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I always think about sort of the false dichotomy sometimes survey researchers put together because obviously attendance and engagement can be good measures. But essentially what we found was pretty surprising was that 92%, more than 9 out of 10 senior pastors say that depth of engagement and commitment are a good metric for measuring the success of a church. Maybe they've been listening to you, Carey, but only 8%.
You know what? I was talking with my team the other day. I'm like, I remember the first post, and I think that is one of the ideas that actually has changed the conversation in the church. So I'm happy about it. And I think that's true. So like, what do pastors mean by depth of engagement? Because that could go in a million different directions. Did you look at specific criteria for that?
We didn't. And that's part of the reason you're going to find this is a reverse interview, because that's the study finding. And now I'm here to ask you, what do you think is in what pastors could be thinking about in terms of depth of engagement? I've got some ideas, which I'll be happy to throw out there, but I wonder what you had in mind when you made that assertion.
Probably when I framed that question almost a decade ago, that assertion, I was looking at, we used to call them in the church model I was in, the 4 things. So you're looking at things like, are they volunteering? Are they giving? Are they inviting friends? Like, are they actually actively engaged in sharing their faith? And then are they part of a community group, right? So you want to look for people who are serving, giving. In other words, am I here consuming or am I contributing? So that was kind of an early start and a simple metric. And we used to talk about people being 3 for 3, 3 for 4 or 4 for 4. And once you got into, I'm doing 3 of the 4 or 4 of those 4 things, I would say you're deeply engaged. And the part that was really encouraging, if you're deeply engaged in something, like if you're a huge football fan or soccer fan or baseball fan, you're engaged, you're all in on your shit. You're not missing games, right? Okay, you're going to sit down, you're going to move your schedule around so that you can catch the game live, not just get the highlights on ESPN the next day. And the same is true of Christians. I mean, if you're inviting your friends and you're tithing, you're giving meaningfully, you're sacrificing your precious time off in the evening or on the weekends or whenever so that you can serve, and you're engaged in community group, like that's an actual thing on your calendar, then chances are you are growing spiritually. But what I'm excited about with State of the Church is you've identified dimensions of human flourishing, 15 metrics of thriving churches, which I think takes it to a whole other level. So anyway, you being the interviewer, that is my answer.
Well, I'm always glad to flip the mic on you, but no, I think that's so helpful because we're continuing our journey to try to help church leaders grow thriving churches. And as you alluded to, we've got 15 different dimensions of a thriving church, which I think helps us to look, it's nurturing, it's sending, it's leading, it's faith sharing, it's faith formation. It's these different elements that I think any of us in ministry hope to see happen in our churches. But that was such a helpful way to think about it. So you said volunteering, giving, inviting friends, and being involved in like a small group or
some kind of like community that's intentional, right? And those are the 4 metrics that I used when I was a lead pastor. I think they're still helpful, but I think we can probably grow that definition a little bit. What I love is you're diving pretty deep in the state of the church and asking these questions, and 92% of pastors agree. And the other thing I would say, last thought before we wrap this up, is attendance still matters. Giving still matters. And my metric on engagement was it's more important than you give than I receive, right? Like, because it doesn't really matter how much you give. It's like, are you really deeply engaged in giving? But then your attendance, your giving, your baptisms, they tend to be lag measures. It's the engagement that creates the lead measures. So anyway, David, you've got a lot more at stateofthechurch.com. We have a special link, stateofthechurch.com/Carey, and we'll be dropping in every month this year, giving special updates along the way. So thanks for joining us to kick off this episode of the podcast.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Warren and Adelle, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you both.
Thanks for having us.
A delight to be back. Thank you.
Yeah. You're like, is this round 6 with you, Warren? First time for Adelle?
Yes, it is.
Round 6. Yeah, you got to be up there. An OG. Podcast OG, which is great. So we're going to talk about the future of the church. The two of you and Daniel Yang have written together a new book called Becoming a Future Ready Church, which I had the privilege of reading through in the early days and endorsing. And I think leaders are looking for hope. So I want to start, it's sort of that Jim Collins, like name brutal reality, but never lose hope. I think that's the tone of this conversation, what it's going to be. But let's start with the camera angle wide. When you think about the most significant trends, and you have literally poured over thousands of data points, what pops? Warren, what for you are a couple of meta trends, meta stats that have really commanded your attention?
All right, you didn't ask me to say this, but reading Carey Nieuwhof blogs and podcasts and all, you'll pick up an awful lot. I tried real hard to pick something that you hadn't emphasized of late.
Good.
And the first is that the role modeling has changed. We all follow role models far more than we acknowledge. And like several things are happening at once. Suspicious of something big, whereas 10, 20 years ago, large churches were the role models. And today it's like, oh, they must be doing something wrong. What's the problem with them? 10, 20 years ago, you couldn't get a hold of anybody else. You would have to go to their conference. Now you just tune into a Carey Nieuwhof podcast or anyone else. Any pastor that I want to follow, I can connect with, which means there can be multiple role models. There aren't just a handful of dominant role models. Meanwhile, you've got a multiplication emphasis shifting in the role models. It's not just enough to grow or even be healthy, but you got to figure out how to multiply. And you've got a discipleship emphasis that's saying, oh, no, it's about making disciple makers, kind of the 2 Timothy 2:2, train others who train others who train others who train others. And all of that has really, on the one hand, blurred, but on the other hand, kind of reset what the role models are for what the church is trying to be and do. And then add on top of that is kind of what is the goal? Long ago, it was like every week is prepare to meet your maker. How do you get ready for eternity? And like I was at a funeral or a funeral home and spoke. And I spoke, just before I spoke to the crowd, I spoke to the lifelong best friend of the person who died. And I said, so tell me, your discussions about eternity and spiritual things. And he said, over the course of X number of decades, we never once were interested enough in the afterlife to talk about it. Well, okay, that's not where people are itching, but that's a whole sea change for how churches approach what they're trying to highlight as the next step. And so today it's far more a series of steps in discipleship than it is that one decisive moment and you're set and now let's go reach other people.
There's a lot there. And I've got to ask you, Adelle, as you poured over so many reports, so much research, had so many conversations with church leaders, what are the meta trends that you have your eye on or the statistics that are jumping out for you?
One thing that's striking me is about post-COVID, so to speak. I've been really fascinated with how churches have and haven't changed because of the pandemic. And the fact that we have hybrid churches, that people say in person and online in the same sentence all the time, to me is actually a sign of hope for the churches, because it shows that they have shifted. And some of them thought they were just going to go back to in-person. Well, that's not what happened. But they're still managing because they're able to do both. And I think that's kind of a trend that fits a lot into what we were writing about in the book.
Okay, so on the meta level, because Warren, I've emailed you or texted you so many times on this, always trying to get the latest data. From what you can tell, how, 5 years on the other side of COVID, 2025, what percentage of churches today are growing? What percentage is plateaued? And what percentage is declining in the American church?
We'll have some hard data in a couple of years, but my gut and initial observations is the gap has just intensified. Those that were growing are growing even more. Those that were struggling, the pandemic accelerated that weakness, that soft spot, and they're hurting even more. And the middle is not as big as before. But the kind of growth is, during the pandemic, there was a whole lot of transfer growth. And that's, you and I actually talked about that on our last podcast together. There are, coming back to your theme of hope, like I talked to, let's say it was one of the 5 largest attendance churches in the United States, senior pastor recently, and he said, I have more hope today because I see more spiritual receptivity today coming out of the pandemic than never before. And lo and behold, his church is growing as never before.
So you're seeing, and again, we'll get percentages at some point. I think the old rule was 85% of churches are plateaued or declining, and maybe 15% are growing. Do you have any gut feel, early returns on whether that number has shifted at all?
No, the more that I'm seeing is people are redefining the goalpost. And they're saying, okay, well, what does it really mean to be growing or declining? And if, every person that a church reaches is a yay God. So let's not diminish anyone's drive to continue to reach that one lost sheep. But at the same time, if my numbers have changed only barely over a several year spread, I can't call that growth by lowering, okay, but I grew by 2% over 10 years. Technically, that's not growing, but it may be doing a wonderful job. The other piece is, who are you reaching? Like Lee Kreitcher, just outside of Pittsburgh, Amplify Church, he said, I'll come and be your pastor if you'll allow me to do one thing, and that's make the congregation the same age as the surrounding community. Do whatever it takes to reach our community in a way that we represent who our community is, age-wise, race, and ethnicity-wise as well. And that, by the way, that journey worked, and they've done it, and they're growing because they're matching their community. So when we talk about plateaued and declining and growing, there's a lot behind the who you're reaching as part of it.
Speaking of the who you're reaching, I wonder about, again, back to the online question as to what the numbers really are. Because when you ask people, even asking what membership now is a question that you really can't answer. You can't get an answer because there are people online and there are people in person, and it's hard to keep track. But I think the fact that there are many churches that will find that there's not that many people there on a Sunday morning, but not just on Sunday, but throughout the rest of the week, the number who've watched that service are more than those who were in person. And so that's like a whole new numbers game. And just because you're not seeing them doesn't mean you're not reaching them.
As I try to remind leaders, a full room doesn't mean a fulfilled mission. Everybody you want to reach is online, right? And I think we're still adjusting to that new reality. And there's a lot of full rooms, but some of that is transfer growth, et cetera, which we've covered on this podcast in the past. Now, Ryan Burge, who wrote the foreword to your latest book, he has said unapologetically that according to his research, his take is the non-denominational church is the biggest force in the church and perhaps in American religion right now. What are you seeing with the rise of non-denominationalism? Adelle, why don't we start with you?
I think it's another way of people not answering questions. I used to ask people, well, what's your denomination? And they would automatically know what to say. And people are moved away from that kind of identity. And I think that's part of what future wanting church leaders need to recognize, is that people just aren't going to identify themselves anymore.
So you think it's more of a cultural categorical thing than a thing?
I think it's both.
okay.
Both. But I think that people are not interested in as much in what their denomination is, as much as any other thing you might ask them that relates to religion. They don't tie themselves to a particular group. They may tie themselves to Jesus. They may say they're Jesus followers, for instance, but there isn't as big a connection to denominations as there used to be.
It's interesting. I don't do a lot of weddings. They tend to be for family and friends. We're a non-denominational church, like strictly speaking, if you had to categorize us. But I know some people who have a denominational background, they're Baptists or whatever, and still in Canada, I have to ask them, what is your religion? Fill out all those forms properly so everyone's legally married. Increasingly for the last 10 years, regardless of denomination, the answer is simply Christian. I'm a Christian. So I write it down. That's what they told me. Nobody's rejected their wedding license since then. But yeah, I think you're right. I think people are eschewing historical labels. Plus, there are a growing number of non-denominational churches. Warren, I'd love your take on that, the growth of non-denominationalism.
Okay, so first, like Daniel Silliman in Christianity Today, he called it not the rise of the nuns, which is a huge phenomenon, but the rise of the nons. And the non-denominational church is 30% across the board for Protestant churches. And among mega churches, it's 40% that would say we are not affiliated with a denomination. But there's some other stuff behind it. For example, the larger the church, the more it behaves non-denominationally. It's that 800-pound gorilla increasingly in its denomination that doesn't fit the denominational rule books, playbooks, traditions. And so it has, and the district leader, superintendent, or whatever, has never led a church like that. So really doesn't know what to do with a church like that. But even more so, like when we did at ECFA the study on the new faces of church planting, we asked, what is your denomination and how strongly connected are you to that denomination?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
And you already can predict where this is going to go. The amount of people who said, well, we're this, but we're just loosely connected with it, is a world different than the first church growth list. We're always first, XYZ church, First Baptist Church, First Assemblies Church, whatever. And now those names are not in the church name. When you, as Adelle was alluding to, when you go to a city, well, I was raised Presbyterian or whatever. And so the first thing I'm going to look for is a Presbyterian church. No, that loyalty is not there at all. So the functionality of non-denominational churches has just continues to grow. I asked Lyle Schaller about that before he died.
Wow.
And he said, easy to explain, 1776. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, that's the year the rebels in the United States said, we'll take this country for ourselves and we'll do it our way. And he said that spirit is in every church denomination that's in the United States from that day forward.
Wow. Okay. Couple of big insights on that. First of all, what Lyle Schaller said, and most people would have no idea who Lyle Schaller was. But I mean, when I was coming up in the 90s, everybody read Lyle Schaller. That makes sense. I mean, if you've read David McCullough, 1776, you'd think, wait, is this about 250 years ago or is this about now? That spirit is still there. The other thing you said that totally resonated, I've seen it a million times, had so many of those congregations. Once a church gets once a church gets to a certain size, it may be denominational, but it's sort of a very loose arm's length affiliation. I'd love to know from either both of you, why is that? Because I think that is a thing. Denominations don't know what to do with them. They don't know what to do with denominations. Why does it get hard to be part of a denomination when you're a larger church?
Probably because people come in who are from all different kinds of denominations or none, and they want to make sure they're speaking their language and keeping them, not just reaching them, but keeping them. So I think there may be a hesitancy to affiliate with a particular group when you have such a wide range within your sanctuary.
When Robert Schuller was sent out to California to found what became the Crystal Cathedral, back then the U.S. Census told people's faith group, and he reported back to his national office, if I tried to reach just those who identify as Dutch Reformed, I'm going to have a very small impact in this whole city of Los Angeles. And so he pioneered this idea that we accept so much today of calling it a community church. Now, it was a denominational connection, but he found that's going to work better. And likewise, Rick Warren, when his other area churches were helping him out, one printed stationery that said, here's for the Saddleback Valley Baptist Church. And he's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to call it a community church, and we're going to reach more people that way. So the logic is that by dropping the denominational name, which was an asset 50, 75 years ago, it's a limiter today. And the larger you get, the more of a limiter it's perceived to be.
All right. So Your research project, your project is really a work of hope. I mean, it's very easy to look at the rise of the nuns, which has plateaued, or look at the number of churches that close every year, or the number, even the size of the average Protestant congregation has shrunk in the last 5 to 10 years, et cetera. It's very easy to be the doom and gloom person, but both of you are, and your co-author, Daniel Yang, are tracing out hope for the future. So in the broadest strokes, where are you finding hope? What are some very hopeful markers that you're finding?
I'm finding hope in innovation. The fact that people are coming up with new ways to do church, new ways to bring people in, things that are not necessarily at 11 o'clock on a Sunday. They might be just playing community service. And I think that's what gives me hope, is that people think, they look around and look over their shoulder and there's nobody sitting next to them or in the next pew, but they may be able to get people to do something outside of the church together that is, in their way, the church. So I think that's part of what gives me hope, is that there are people with new ideas and putting them into practice.
I think first our model for hope is the guy who sat in prison and wrote epistles about hope and talked about the God of hope. He could have moaned and groaned about how bad things are and, how many people
not great here.
got burned at the stake, this week. But his letters, like Philippians from the jail, were full of hope. Romans written to about the God of hope in the chapters 5 to 8. So this was Christianity as a tiny minority in a very oppressed culture, saying, we have the life-changing, freeing hope of the world. And the blessed hope may be Christ's second coming, but the hope that we have now is a peace that passes all understanding, to use Jesus' words. So we have that model. And yes, all the projections, and we highlight these in the book, say that in the United States, Christianity will be the minority faith, not the majority. And just going back to 1950s, the heyday of Christianity in America, 92% of people identified with Christianity. And now Gallup has every year the fewer and fewer people identify as church members and all. So, but why? What prevents us from having hope then? An analogy: Ezra 3 talks about coming back from captivity, and the older folks wept as they were rebuilding the temple because it wasn't the dimensions of the new. The newer generation were ecstatic. Hey, look at all we can do, and we're getting help from to rebuild it and all. It's all in your perspective. And likewise, today's generation doesn't know about the liberal mainline split. I mean, nobody would even believe if I said, when I was in school, we started school assemblies with the Lord's Prayer, public school, the Lord's Prayer, and the teacher read a Bible devotional. Okay, that day is gone. But we have so many opportunities for the gospel. And finally, if you study those across the board who say they never attend church, but do you believe in a God or higher power? For the last 30 years, that percentage has been roughly unchanged in the high 70s or low 80s, that I know something is out there. Well, that means those people are reachable. That should give us lots of hope.
When you say that Christians, all the studies are pointing to the fact that Christians are going to be in the minority in America, can you drill down on that a little bit? Like statistically, what does that look like? And
so
when?
Pew ran 4 scenarios, one of which is if it depends on immigration. I can't put it back together, but if people will Google Pew and that topic, you will find the scenarios. In fact, you could read our book where we unpack it for a few pages and explain. But no matter what variations are in tow, the overall church-going America will be less than 50% by the year 2040. Do you remember, Adele, got off?
2050, I think. It might be 2040. I think you're right.
Yeah. And I mean, basically, the way I look at that, and correct me if I'm wrong, what's happening on the coasts over the last few decades is going to happen across even the Bible Belt. You know, when you look at the East Coast, New England, when you look at California or Oregon or Seattle, Washington, when you see that, that's sort of becoming the cultural milieu of America, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, yes, Ed Stetzer puts it together in a way I love. He says if you divide 4 quadrants, one quadrant is kind of the Bible-believing, church-engaged segment of America, whatever you call the label with the evangelical fundamentalists, whatever. That has remained constant. And on the other end, there's a quarter of people who are no faith, different religions and all. That has remained somewhat constant. The 50% in the middle, for decades, aligned with biblical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last 10 to 20 years, they have realigned with the other segment. And so everybody's saying, well, where did they go? In part, they were never really engaged and wholehearted with it. They were just verbally affiliating with the dominant presence of a biblical expression of Christian faith. So in a lot of ways, people's alignments have changed, but the heart issues and the needs are still roughly the same.
There's also that sense of acceptability, you know, it used to, or respectability, where people were kind of assumed to be part of that segment that Warren first described, you know, very much involved in faith in some way, shape, or form. And now more people who maybe really weren't are admitting to that and identifying that way. And that's where you get more of the nuns or the people at least who are not particularly affiliated with a particular house of worship.
Let's drill down on the nuns for a little bit, because you've got quite a bit of material in your research on the nuns. And what are you discovering about the people who describe as having no religion in particular? What are you discovering about them? Because a lot of them have a Christian past, right? Maybe they grew up in Sunday school. They went to church at one point. Have they all deconverted? What's going on?
Adelle, why don't you tell about, there are a bunch of long stories in the book, different case studies from different churches. Why don't you go to Alpha and the Coops up in Vancouver as maybe representative of how this group is being reached?
Thanks, Warren. Yeah. And the interesting thing about the Coops, this is Cheryl and David Coop, of Coastal Church in Vancouver. They are using something that some of your listeners will perhaps recall, and that is Alpha, which has been around for a while. And it's a 10-week evangelistic course. It teaches people about the basics of Christianity. And they are using that after having tried some other methods that didn't work to bring people in. And one of the things they say is that it treats the problem that many people are having in many cities and towns and boroughs, and that is loneliness, that people want to get together once a week and spend time with each other, and in this case, learn about Christianity. And the people that are coming to this are all different ages and races and backgrounds and religions or no religion. A lot of them are 30-somethings, which is like the group that many churches are wondering how can they get in. And a lot of them have no religious affiliation, which is the case for like 50% of the people in Vancouver. So people get together. But the other thing is they don't just get together to talk about the Bible. They get together over a meal. And it could be a very nice touch kind of room in a high-rise building where they have a lot of those in Vancouver. Or it could be a basement of a church with teenagers getting together with pizza. But they are together. They're learning from each other. And not only are they learning from each other and learning about faith, they then may go out for coffee later and continue to have friendships, which they may not have had before. So it's all a piece. And some of them become Christians after being part of Alpha. Some of them get into the community service that this church is doing, either in Canada or abroad, or they may take the course again. In some cases, they take it a third time, which means that there's some interest out there that people may not realize.
And these are majority unchurched people, like people who would say no religion in particular?
There are people who would be, it's a variety. Some of them are no religion in particular, but some of them are from another faith beyond Christianity.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's a combination of people coming in who haven't explored Christianity for one reason or the other.
Our church is north of Toronto, the one that I helped start and we're still a part of. Alpha, we ran 20 years ago, and it was incredibly effective. And then we went through a period where we didn't run it for a while. We've run it again, maybe over the last 5 or 6 years. And it is just unbelievable to see who comes in the door through Alpha, like from complete atheists to agnostics to nuns to people who were Muslim, and they're coming to find Jesus. It's amazing to see how God's using Alpha. What else is your research showing us about the nuns?
Warren, you go ahead.
That, as I alluded to before, no religious preference doesn't mean I don't believe in God. I don't believe in a higher power. It simply means I was born something. I don't own it at all. So I'm not even going to claim it as a tag, which I see as making them all the more reachable. Because rather than having to get through their church affiliation language, oh, well, I'm a Christian because, I was whatever happened as a kid in this church, they just jettison that. And there's a greater openness to discussion about real issues. The percentages of people who say, I am open to talking about faith issues with a person I trust, as in a friend, is really high. So while the pulpit, this Sunday, my gym attendant, I've invited him to church. He's coming with his live-in fiance and their 3-year-old kid. And I'm thinking, okay, can the church accept them where they are? They want to do things God's way from everything I can tell. So can the church embrace them and help them have that fresh start? And is it the kind of place that someone who has a lot of questions about God will be freely welcome to ask them? And if it is that safe kind of environment, there are a lot of people like my gym attendant out there and who, over friendship that I cultivated over many months, and one time said, well, it's Easter, Christmas, whatever. Do you have somewhere to go? And we're far from any of those holidays at this moment, but it's taken that long to be able to invite. Okay, well, he didn't say, well, I was born, whatever. There were no labels. He's the no religious affiliation. But I'm happy to talk about it with you, my friend.
Well, first of all, the gym, good for you. And secondly, actually practicing what you preach. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Well, I'm a terrible evangelist, but one of the shifts that's occurred, if we'd gone back to Warren, some more church trends, over recent years, the motif has been let the church help you in your evangelism. If you can, we'll give you excuses to invite your friend, and this is all wonderful. But church leaders may have slackened off on, but let me teach you how to actually share your faith, give your testimony, invite someone, start a spiritual conversation, and putting it back on us as we all have the privilege of talking with people that we could influence for Christ.
Yeah, I totally see that. One of the things that your research showed, let me back up a little bit. One of the things I tell people all the time, including my team, it's like, hey, don't say no for somebody. So it's like, oh, I wonder if so-and-so would come on the podcast. Oh, they're probably too busy. They're probably like, whoa, I don't want to say no for somebody, right? So on that note, I think it's easy to say no for people who don't attend church. We just assume they're all atheists. They're not interested. They've been burned. They have church hurt. They've deconstructed. The research, and tell me if I got this wrong, Adelle, the main reasons people cite for not attending church aren't theological, they're practical. Like, I don't fit in, I moved, it was inconvenient. Are those some of the reasons people are not attending church? It's not like, I'm an atheist and I don't believe in God. It's like that simple. Like, I moved to a new community, it's inconvenient. What are you learning about people who don't attend church?
I think that part of it is the don't fit in, and that means that churches need to have a sense of belonging and give people a way to belong, like we were talking about with Alpha as one example. But In fact, that was a graphic that was in the story, in the book that Warren found for us related to the not fitting in. That was like one of the main reasons people said they weren't coming. It wasn't
What
because
does
they
that
didn't like
mean? I
theology.
don't fit in.
It means that they are hesitant to darken the door of a church because they don't know how they're going to be received. They may feel like they're not going to be accepted for who they are, or people might ask them questions they don't want to be asked. And I did write about Life.Church, which is in Edmond, Oklahoma, and many, many more places now. And they stopped emphasizing the term membership, and they focused instead on this sense of belonging. And it used to be that they had to have people sign every year what they were going to do. And that might be another reason people don't want to darken the doors. They're afraid they're going to have to sign up for everything as soon as they come in. And this church has said, no, let's work on having people feel more like how can they contribute? They said they moved from people being consumers where they just sit and do nothing, but just let everybody else do anything they might do in a church, but instead figure out how they're going to contribute, helping in the community, being part of a Bible study, giving financially, but not necessarily making it the first thing the person has to do when they walk in. One way they make it more welcome is they introduce themselves every time they walk in, the people walk in the church, and which is something that whether it's a huge church like that one or a small one, the minister can introduce themselves every time and not assume everybody knows who they are. That helps you have a sense of belonging. And also, like that church that tells the first time visitors, you don't have to put anything in the offering bucket. These are little things, but they can make a big difference. I mean, if I were visiting a church for the first time and they told me that I didn't have to give anything in the offering plate, I'd be impressed that they weren't pushing for that, even though they probably need that. So those are kinds of things that various kinds of congregations could do to try to help people feel more like they could fit in instead of feeling like, oh, wait, I'm never coming back here again.
I just interviewed Craig Groeschel, lead pastor at Life Church, about some of the changes they've made, even in the last year or two, to try to assimilate community at scale. They're I believe, the largest attended church in the history of America, which is unbelievable. And they're really doubled down on community. They've loosened their definition of what counts. They're trying to connect with people personally. And I think they also embody, Adele, to your point, the whole idea that they don't forget that every Sunday is somebody's first Sunday. You might have 80,000, 100,000 people attending your different locations, but every Sunday is somebody's first Sunday, and they've remembered that. Warren, what are you seeing in reasons that people give for not going to church?
First, let me underscore what you just said. Yesterday, I talked with Dr. William Kimui, the pastor of one of the largest attendance churches in Africa. There'd be easily and reliably more than 100,000 people on any given Sunday. And his whole emphasis was exactly what you said from Craig Groeschel. It's about community. It's about the small group, that if they'll be lost in the crowd, but if they're connected in a small group and cared for and nurtured and helped to grow spiritually, then they will thrive and flourish regardless of how large the overall assembly is. So this is not just an American thing. And in talking with him, he got that from Yonggi Cho in Korea. And it's around the world of ways that you grow bigger by getting smaller, by figuring out what community means for each generation and how to grow that. One of the dimensions, in more specific answer to your question in the book that we highlight, is you can't assume that homogeneity happens just because you're all in the same group. As churches become more diverse, hospitality over food, fellowship, intentionality across races, ethnicities, ages is going to become all the more important. And without that element of intentionality, the cohesiveness of the church and therefore the growth of the people in their walk with God is not going to happen.
Anything else you want to say about diversity? Because that's another trend. You look at America today, America 20 years ago, America 20 years in the future. Caucasian people will be in the minority, almost already are. And America is going to look very different in the future. What are the implications of that for the church?
Adele might have a story about that, but let me give you just a quick stat. 1950, 88% of America was white. 2050, by U.S. Census projections, 44%. From 88% to 44%.
Literally halved.
such that today's Gen Z and Alpha, if they come in a group and it is not racially diverse, their antenna immediately go up and say, what's the matter with this place? What's the matter with this group that they don't represent what we are as a country?
The story that I wrote that related to diversity in the book was actually about a church that was predominantly Black, had a lot of Caribbean members from lots of different countries. So their diversity wasn't specifically, wasn't just about race. It was about, the country people had come from. But what's interesting is that Charles Galbraith, the leader of that church, nevertheless saw his community that was 97% Black and Caribbean and said, wait, there's still some other people out there that need to be reached. And he admitted that when his first approach was to try to do something within the walls of his own congregation, his own building. And it was later that he realized, no, we need to do something separate. And they ended up with a separate campus that had white people, Latina people, and a few Caribbean people too, meeting their needs in a different way. It was more artsy. The community was more artsy. They were meeting in a way that others weren't, like with dinner church. So instead of just meeting, sitting in church at a pew or a seat, they had people sitting around a table eating together and also having discussion and being able to talk more and have more give and take. All of that made a difference as far as the diversity that church was able to serve. And so that's like an example that could be replicated no matter what race you're talking about being predominant in a church, is to see, well, who are we missing? Who's different from us, but who might want to be with us and who we should want to have with us? And that's kind of what he was demonstrating.
I want to test something with you on that note. I've always felt like a church should reflect its community. So if you're in a community that's 97% Caribbean, okay, you're going to have a Caribbean church, right? But is that still accurate, or would you challenge that? Like, I just think, look at the demographic breakdown of your community. Your church should be within a few percentage points of that.
So I happen to know the history of that church. It's in Brooklyn, New York, and they were an all-white church, and the neighborhood was changing, and there was big discussion in the church as people moved out but kept commuting in on Sunday, that we don't represent our community. Should we intentionally become more like our immediate community? And Phil Bliss, the pastor at that time, courageously led the all-white church to become integrated and ultimately to pass the leadership baton to a person of a different race. And over time, when you look at, they say, well, for America's largest corporations that were on the Dow Jones 100 or whatever, so many of them don't exist anymore today. Well, the same is true for the largest attendance churches. And one of the many key factors in those declines is often neighborhood change and the church not changing with the neighborhood.
That's a really good point. The other thing that really jumped out at me, I've known that family and households are changing, but when I looked at your research, kind of blew my mind. Can you talk about how our understanding, because I think a lot of pastors, probably myself included, still think, oh, we're going to reach married people with 2 kids and, that's going to fill up our church. That's increasingly an rare species, isn't it? What are you learning about the composition of the American family today and in the future?
So it's understandable that as the culture redefines marriage, we recently celebrated Jimmy Carter, and he was famous for saying to his staff, hey, those of you living in sin, stop shacking up, and you're setting an example for the nation. It's a bad example. Well, can you imagine a president today saying that and it being socially acceptable?
You might imagine the opposite today. Yeah.
Or a Canadian premier or anyone else.
Oh, yeah. Well, but let's not go there.
So as a result, churches have said, if there's any place we want to champion marriage, if there's any place we want to focus on helping you have a thriving marriage, it needs to be the church. And so the staff people of the church all tend to be married, and this is the focus. And the programming of the church, therefore, tends to focus on married people. And yet, the society, not just around us, but inside of us in the church, as one of our graphics shows, and as listeners have probably picked up, every chapter has a great story from Adelle, has a few statistics from myself, and then a lot of narrative to build around it. Is the growth of not just single adults, which is now like 1 out of 3, but those who are married, those who have children but are not married. And that group has risen as well. So the question to churches is not, stop emphasizing marriage, but how can you serve people who are adopting children, or people in blended families, or people who are struggling to have children and not having it? I mean, there's so many varieties today. Can the church meaningfully speak to that whole group? And Adelle, did we do a story on that one too?
Yeah, I got to interview Carl Johnson, who has a church called Faith City Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he has several different ways that he approaches this topic of families. He serves families in his church who are of a wide variety. It could be single moms, single dads, multiracial families. And that's what you see at worship time, but also around the community that they serve. But he points out that when the worship time ends, they segue into fellowship time, but they tell the parents to stay put, leave their kids in the separate but safe area their kids have been in during the service, and just relax for a few minutes, maybe even like 15 or 20 minutes. And he says, have a conversation with another adult for 20 minutes, 10 minutes. And it's something they may only have that opportunity to have once in a blue moon, or maybe on that Sunday, because they're so busy as single adults working to keep their kids busy and involved in things. They never had time to talk to another adult. And he realized that, and they've set that time aside within their congregation. But beyond that, this church also has a very unique ministry to families in that it has a grocery store in the same space that they have their worship space. And so during the rest of the week, the neighborhood that has many people who are food insecure will come in and get food at a very discounted price, eggs, cereal, that kind of thing. And he says one of his most heartwarming moments in a week is when a kid comes in with a single parent, reaches for something on the shelf, and the parent doesn't say, no, put that back, because they were able to afford it. So there's this sense of dignity. There's this sense of almost community transformation. And the congregation is transformed as well, because they're meeting a need. They're finding out that the people they may have seen walking down the street are hungry and can't afford groceries otherwise, or have access to them. And their church is helping that happen.
So I'm looking at the graph. It's page 44 of your book. And I don't think I'm doing a very good job showing it. I don't know that we can reproduce it with the publisher's permission, but just to show this in the show
Carey
notes would be
Nieuwhof,
crazy.
we will get the publisher's permission.
We'll get the publisher's permission. The thing that got me in 1960, it looks like 45% of households were married with children. Single person households, like 12%, 13%. I haven't got the exact numbers. Now, today in 2020, the number of one-person households exceeds the number of people who are married with children in America, and the number of single parents with children is now double digits. So it's insane. Like, if you're imagining the suburbs are filled with first marriage, married with children, 2 parents at home, 2 kids, you're imagining a world that no longer predominantly exists. What are the implications for churches? Like, what do we need to, we've touched on them a little bit, but anything else in terms of advice for how to deal with that reality?
I would say even sermon illustrations need to be thought about. Because if you're just going to talk about, 2 parents at a PTA meeting with their kids, worried about their kids, that's not the scenario for a person who's listening to that sermon.
Right. And almost every pastor is married with children. If you look at, if we were to do the same graph for, and there's divorced pastors, single pastors. I mean, I get it. Okay. But I bet you it's 80 to 90% of pastors are married with children. In fact, I've heard from people who are single, guys in their 30s who are like, it's harder to get hired when you don't have a wife and you don't have kids. That's just the church milieu. Warren, any final thoughts on the changing role of family and what we can do? Great point, Adelle, about varying your illustrations from white middle-class life. Yeah.
So the overarching theme of our book is don't lead your church alone. Listen to the voices of the younger generation.
Yeah.
Do it we almost named the book Preparing for 2050. And your first response would be, but I won't be alive and kicking, or at least in a leadership role by 2050. And that's exactly the point. Yeah. That you need to partner with the next generation, and they know what's reaching their friends. They know what language is challenging, or what apologetic is working, or what kind of role modeling relationally male-female is going to connect best with their generation. Not in any way saying change the Bible, but the language we use as we teach the Bible to connect with the rising generation. Get help. It's in your congregation. They'd love to speak to you and guide you and dialogue with you for how to reach their peers, who ultimately will be the church.
Can we talk for a minute? I don't know that this is directly in your latest research, but you have done a ton of research over your life, Warren. Talk about the aging out of church staff and senior pastors. I mean, I think roughly the data in the 1990s, the average senior pastor was 45. Now that's pushing mid to upper 50s. It seems like, if you're 30, you're leading an AI company that's literally changing history and changing the world. If you're 30 in the church, you're barely out of young adults ministry and not ready for the senior leadership table. What are you learning about demographics when it comes to church staff? Because I think you're right. The only way to really affect change is to get younger voices around the table, but that's not happening a lot.
Well, you are absolutely right that the average age of pastor of all sizes of churches is going up. Well, in part, we have a longevity issue that we're living longer. So that
we are living longer.
In certain ways, understandable. In part, people are who get married or starting families and all later. So the average age of the church planter, the starting church, being a little older, it is a little bit understandable. But the overall concern that the church does not represent the population around it, the overall concern that we're not mentoring the next generation is troublesome, especially since today, in my generation, I didn't want anything to do with my parents' generation growing up. Today's generation, in general, loves the multi-generational approach and the mentoring and reverse mentoring of back and forth that can happen. There is no better opportunity to lead multi-generationally than today. And the reason this is a concern is the average age of a congregation is the senior leader's age minus about 5 years.
Okay,
Why is
say
that?
Say that again.
The average congregation is the senior leader's age minus about 5 years. The reason being, if I've got teenagers, and that's the life stage I'm in, predict the church is going to have a killer youth group. Predict junior high parents, middle school parents are like, oh, this is the church for us because there's a youth group my kids can grow into. Or if I'm talking about grandkids and all, who's that going to attract? If I'm talking about kids in diapers, who's that going to attract and say, oh, there's some wisdom here, there's some emphasis here. So you need to dilute, and I understand Kara Powell is one of your upcoming guests. Mm-hmm. Fuller Youth Institute has done some marvelous work, a marvelous book on growing younger as a church. And in part, it's this idea of handing the keys, figuratively and literally, to the next generation.
Adelle, what are your thoughts on the aging of clergy and church staff, particularly senior church staff?
I do think you're pointing out a really big issue. And I think that where there is a focus on intergenerational work and ministry, that is going to be one of the keys for the future of the church. When I talked to Jason Shepard of Life.Church, he talked about how people went from being small group leaders to leaders of house churches. And he talked about the kids running around in the house where there is someone hosting the church that's part of his church, a smaller group of people meeting together. But it wasn't just people of one age. They had activities for the kids. They had kids seeing their parents in another room grappling with, how they related to the Bible discussion of the week. And that was part of what makes a difference. The leadership is intergenerational. The church in meeting in small groups is not just one generation as well. And I think that is a key for the future, is that people are seeing themselves come together and explore their faith together and not just thinking it has to be a person of a particular age who's leading it all.
So let me ask you a question that, I'm not trying to set you up to fail, but it's a tough question. So I tapped out of the lead pastor role when I was 50. There were a variety of reasons, which I've talked about publicly, but one of them was exactly what you said, Warren. I think the congregation's going to age with me if I keep doing this. And, I didn't know that this would become what it's become, but I had other options. And so I pursued those, and God was extremely kind in the process. And we're still part of our church, but I'm not on stage hardly at all anymore, maybe once or twice a year. And that is a guest. So does that mean we all have to fall on our swords at 50? I remember having, when right after I did that, I went to DC and had dinner with Mark and Laura Batterson. And, everyone was like, man, you're so young. And Mark's like, yeah, you are. And yet the Old Testament, the priest would retire at 50. Now that was a different generation, different time. But, and not everybody can do it. They don't have the finances, et cetera. But I'm just curious, what's your thought? Do we need to see more people taking voluntary leaves? Just what is the prescription? If the patient is aging, what is the prescription?
Teaching team for at least that part of the leadership that covers a huge diversity of ages, typically younger. Although I just talked to a pastor of a extremely large church who said he hired someone older than him because they have, the segment of the population that's 55 and above is a huge slice that we're so busy sometimes reaching the next generation of youth that we don't think, man, these are people with volunteer potential, giving potential, maturity potential. They could change our community for good, if that could just be harnessed as well. But most churches need to bring in younger voices on the teaching team. That will go wonders. Also, who gives you feedback on your sermons? The larger the church, the more I find there's a sermon feedback constancy. And is it your peers of your age, or is it intentionally the 20-somethings, 30-somethings, and sometimes younger? Even the writing of this book. I'm a boomer. Adele's an Xer. Daniel Yang is a millennial.
I'm actually a young boomer, but anyway.
She's Gen Z. Yeah.
Not quite.
Not quite. The millennial.
The book was so much better because we had perspectives from different generations.
Yeah. Adele, what's your take on that? Do we need to fall on our sword, just get cross-generational? What are you thinking?
I just think it's important to make sure that there is cross-generational work. I'm not going to say anybody who turns 50 has to hang up their clerical robe, but I do think that there has to be a way of not thinking that, if you're 30, you can't do anything in this church yet. And that has been the thought for a lot of churches for a long time.
Too long. I mean, I was in my 20s.
Then have the 30-something people leave because they don't see potential for their being a leader in that church if they're not given a chance.
Two things. I only did law for a year, but they threw me to the wolves. They were I was maybe 26, 27. And they're go argue in court almost every day. They let me figure it out. And you figure it out even in your 20s. Like I say, if you're 30, you can be the CEO of an AI startup that's literally changing the world. But in the church, you're still in the youth group. But to your point, someone who hired a millennial or Gen Z who hired someone older to teach. I do not do guest preaching. I always say no. I rarely get asked because I always say no. But there's a guy I've gotten to know who's 30. The average age of his church is 25. And he was texting me the other day and he goes, you wouldn't be willing to do a message. We desperately need someone your age in this church. And I'm like, for you, yes. And it's nice to be recruited for that. But and when I've taught at Connexus, it's been a while, I have specifically convened focus groups of Gen Z teenagers, people in their 20s to like test my ideas and update my sense of reality to make sure I'm not talking like some old white guy, who doesn't know what he's doing or lives in the past.
Can I offer one more illustration?
Please.
Besides younging up the preaching team. This is from Heart of God Church in Singapore, which, like so many church plants, start off young, youth group that kind of grows into a congregation, and they kind of all age together. And then one day you look around and go, where's the next generation of young people? And it's because you haven't done it. This church, every 3 years, restarts its youth group. I mean, it's an all church focus to say we're going to start a whole new cohort. You can't be a lay leader and just shift down to the next one. It's got to be a whole new crowd. And they have 7 different times rebuilt the youth group to start over and to start a new cohort coming through the church. Now, meanwhile, the senior pastors, husband and wife, they're aging. They can't go back to 3 years. But because the youth group is the average age in the church has remained in its 20s, low 20s at that, for the life of the church at 20 years and counting, which I just think is a brilliant strategy for keeping the church young when we have this human problem of leaders getting older.
And what I'm hearing in all of your examples is intentionality.
Yes.
This does not happen by osmosis, by accident, or by hope. It happens because you take action. I want to talk a little bit about the new apologetic. I'm kind of fascinated by apologetics. I feel like that is what you're doing if you're preaching, if you're actually doing evangelism. What needs to change in apologetics? Why? And what is the new apologetics?
The pause is because that's such a good question and such an important question. And Adelle, are you bursting to start?
I am not. You go right ahead, Ryan.
I was going to touch this. Yeah.
So, okay. First, it's moved from inside the church to the outside. So I'm going to make up a scenario. 50 years ago, what would be the killer thing that I could invite you to my church? Oh, we support all these missionaries overseas. Well, I got to be a part of a church like that. Well, maybe 10 years later, we have this killer choir. You'd really love to see it, experience it. Okay, 10 years later, we have this killer children's ministry or youth group. Again, this is all inside the church. Now, getting more recent, our church is just killing it with a soup kitchen. Oh, this is outside the church. That's what's the wow factor that causes my neighbor to say, oh, tell me more about this faith. You do good? Tell me about the God behind the good. Today, it's even more so. Well, we do advocacy for the homeless or for people caught in sex trafficking or justice ministries. In fact, today's generation, even in evangelical churches, if there isn't some kind of justice emphasis, there's a hollowness feeling of, well, something's not quite right here. Are we really living out the fullness of the gospel of, yes, salvation individual, but the implications of that for the world around us? So all that to say, I'm seeing more and more churches carry their apologetic outside their walls. It's not just invite a friend in. We've all probably even preached the analogy. It used to be, is it true? And then a generation later is it right? And today it's is it good? Is your religion in particular good for our community? And what the twist is good for how I define good. In my sense of what would be good for this community, does your church contribute to that, or are you a detractor to that? So the more churches are able to say the cup of cold water, the Matthew 5:18, let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And I heard the story, and I'll land on this, of a school leader, a principal, I think it was, coming to the church and saying, I'm not a religious person, but I thank God for this church because of all the good that your church has done for my school in your tutoring and your fixing up the teacher's lounge and all the things you've done. You are such a welcome piece of this community. And churches which have been pushed by society to the edges have to re-earn that spot to say, this is how we contribute to the public good in the name of Jesus, and we'd love to tell you about him.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I might add is that our co-author, Daniel Yang, explained how those apologetics conferences of decades ago were the thing, where you'd have certain people who were just known as apologists of the faith would have debates with people who were known as atheists. And that was like drawing a crowd, certain academic circles, et cetera. And now we're like in a completely different phase. And that new apologetics is in some ways that older one, again, related to Alpha, places where people can have smaller discussions and understand the faith in a more intimate setting, you might say. And in fact, the word good came up. David Koop, the pastor of that coastal church in Vancouver, he talked about how people felt like they found the good, as he put it, in their faith by studying with this small group and understanding better and meeting with people over a meal and being able to ask whatever they wanted to ask. And that was the other part of it, is that when you're letting people learn about the faith, if you let them ask whatever, that means people will be free and feel like they can ask things they might never have been comfortable asking before. And that's another piece of it as well.
Yeah, and I echo with that. Living in a post-Christian culture my whole life, being Canadian, spent a ton of time in the U.S. and abroad, but that really resonates. One of the top objections is this God even good? Because most of the Christians I know are kind of mean and judgmental and hypocritical, or I don't know any Christians. So what are you guys about? And, to paraphrase Tom Holland and his book Dominion, Christianity has done definitely a lot of bad in the name of Jesus, but the ethic that most people would consider good is inherently Christian, and sometimes we forget that. I would be remiss.
Just before you leave, Can I give you a Canadian illustration? The largest
100%.
attendance church in Canada, I'm interviewing several of their staff tomorrow about their outreach, and they said, we are multi-pronged. Let us tell you our most effective outreach. And they have a compassion ministry group that feeds the homeless. They have a new Canadian friendship hub, which is about immigrants and helping them on the way in. They have discipleship and outreach, which is characterized by Alpha. They have disability ministry, people with special needs. Churches that do that ministry well are just like magnets. And then they have a sports ministry to their community. And like between all those prongs, they're all feeders to connect people at their point of felt need to show how the gospel makes a difference in day-to-day life.
So if you're free to say, I have to ask, which church is that?
Henry Shore is the pastor, Center Street Church. And I believe that's the largest attendance church in Canada right now.
Amazing. He's been there for a long time, too. It's great to see.
Leader.
I believe they're Calgary. Yeah. I want to ask about digital ministry, because that's something the church kind of dove into head first 5 years ago for obvious reasons, and now people are feeling skittish about it again. Got some of the latest stuff from Craig Rochelle and Life Church on a recent interview, which will already have aired by the time this airs, so you can scroll back and get that. They're embracing it. Craig said it so well to me a few years ago, 100% in on person, 100% in on digital. What are you learning about digital ministry and effective ministry in the second quarter of the 21st century?
I wrote about a church called Imagine Church that really thinks outside the box about digital ministry, so much so that they are almost completely digital. And they have communities that are those little faces on a Zoom screen. And in fact, they say if it gets over like the 9 or so where you can see people well, that they want to have another group form because they want people to have that intimate connection. And one of the things they did, which is pretty interesting, I think, is how they got started, is they started a sermon and then they paused and they asked the group to talk about the sermon and figure out how it applied to them before the preacher went on. And the early example was back when there were wildfires previously in California, and the people were able to talk in their group in California about how they were going to help minister to people at that time. And so one of the ministers, Justin Cloud, was saying, that's church. They're figuring out what to do in a way that if they're located in other places, pastors, that they can't do. And so there is an assumption that when you have a digital community that you can't have a real community. And one of my favorite examples of that story is that these people actually meet all across the week, different days of the week, and from different places across the country. And in one instance, a gentleman lost his wife. She passed away, and the people in his group wanted to do something for him, even though they didn't live nearby. And they collected enough for an Uber Eats gift card. And one of the people in the community was a flight attendant, and she made a stopover and delivered the card to the man in person. So that's just totally thinking outside the box and an example of how you can still really be together, even if you're physically apart in a digital ministry.
Warren, how about you? What are you seeing?
Well, I'll start with a personal example. My wife and I lead a Couples of the Old Testament marriage class, and we kicked it off in person. We're doing it by Zoom during the evening.
Couples of the Old Testament. I'm just getting 17 wives in my head. What is that, Warren?
Adam and Eve.
Okay.
The blame game. Abraham and Sarah waiting on God for a promise that didn't happen.
Good clarification.
The issues they dealt with then are just as real as the ones we need to deal with, and just as bizarre too.
Okay,
but at any rate,
you.
People, put their kids in bed and then flop on the sofa next to each other and do it by Zoom. They couldn't do it if they had to get a sitter every week and all. So that integration, and we'll have a happily ever after in-person gathering party when it's all done. So that integration of in-person and the hybrid that Adelle spoke of is constant. But what about those churches that are having people at distances and unable to come in person, and just because of drive time? So we, ECFA did a study, took the Outreach 100 fastest growing churches, and we said, all right, how many of you have more people online than in person on Sundays, and your online is growing faster? And there were churches with 1,000 plus in person and thousands online. And the logic, as one of the pastors from
what was the result of that? Most people had more people online or fewer?
Well, this was a very select group.
Yeah.
This was fast-growing entrepreneurial churches. They did have, it was half and half, but all of them were shifting to say, our staffing, our structure, our discipleship, we have to rethink all of this for how do we serve the growing crowd online. The logic, because everybody begins with, is this biblical and all, it says, start with the Apostle Paul. He said in his letters, look, I'd love to be there in person. I'd love to disciple you in person, but I can't. So I'm going to write a letter and show you what to do. I want you to do these things by the power of the Holy Spirit. And when I get there, we'll talk about it some more. So it's discipleship can happen remotely. That was remote for back then, parchment letters. So how is it being done today? And what churches are doing is fascinating. And we wrote that up. You can ecfa.org/surveys, plural. You can find 3 reports where we highlight what churches are doing. And frankly, a webinar where I talked to about 6 different churches, including Crossroads and Sandals. Elevation Church says they're again an outlier, but they say more than half the people, just up to half of their giving comes from people who live more than 100 miles from any campus.
Wow.
Process that. So, is this a group we can disciple? Can we get them into house watch parties or any other kind of gatherings to in-person them or to disciple them online? And I am convinced that the entrepreneurs are finding breakthroughs, and as in just a matter of years, we'll have lots more strong models of how do we effectively do discipleship online and in person, and truly the world can be my parish for almost any church.
Mm-hmm. Another great example of that is Church Home. I just came back from a week with some of their core team and key people. And what they're doing, they've taken a lot of criticism for it, but basically pivoting to a digital first strategy. I think is breaking ground for the church. So you're right. There's some outliers who are innovating. They're winning on some fronts, failing, falling down, picking themselves back up, getting back up and figuring it out. And I think we'll have a lot to export to the church. But that shouldn't stop small churches from experimenting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to point out one other thing I forgot to mention about Imagine Church, and that is that some of the people who are in these community groups are ill and unable to leave the house, like people with MS. They still want to go to church, but they just can't go to church. And so this ministry has recognized that. And you can hear the caring in the voice of these pastors for people like that who are part of the church.
And any size church is the case. I think the smallest church that took the survey was just like 60 people. And it was, if I remember right, a Pakistani believer married to an American. And he said, you wouldn't believe with the internet how we have found other churches where Pakistani believers and Americans are together, and we're trying to figure out, how do we tailor church to our cultures and all, and we're networking with each other all over the world, and it's so exciting. So that's their niche, and isn't that awesome?
That is such a good point, because no matter what your niche is, and this is a good word for small churches, like you've mentioned the church that had ministry to disabled people, ministry to the sick, but you think about people who are hobbyists, right? I have a few friends who are deep into cycling or deep into electronic dance music. And I mean, they connect with people around the world around their hobby, and they know them. One of my good friends is a coffee enthusiast. He knows people literally all over the world who geek out about coffee. And if you think about it, those people want to connect. So the fact that there's a Pakistani spouse and an American spouse, yeah, there's not just two of them. I mean, you can find your niche community almost anywhere online. So I got to ask you as we wrap up, we've covered a lot of ground. When you're thinking about, I'm going to call them meta skills, okay? What are some of the overarching skills that you think church leaders need to develop to be ready for a future-ready church, to get their church ready? What are a couple of strategies, qualities, characteristics that they should embrace to get ready for what's ahead?
I'd say first is to not let it be thought that the pastor's doing everything, the pastor's leading everything. It's really a family affair, as some of the ministers have said. They really want the church to be like a family, which means everybody works. And it also means it's not just the usher at the door who welcomes people. Anybody can do that in the church if they just get up and stick out their hand. So part of it is that it's a corporate way of doing church, corporate small c, I guess you'd say, because it really should involve lots of different people, whether it's the volunteers, the lay people, or the ordained people, so that nobody gets burned out, because that is part of the problem. And, post-COVID, a lot of the volunteers didn't come back at first because for once they'd had a break,
They're like, this is what rest is. Yeah.
But yes, yeah. Exactly. So really, there is a need for a different kind of mindset to help churches make it to the future.
So the overarching theme of the Becoming a Future-Ready Church is be adaptive, and don't do that alone. Find someone younger than you and explore adaptations together. And we use the 1% factor to conclude each chapter by saying, if you're in an airplane and you're just 1 degree off, you're going to end up in a totally different place. But likewise, if you can figure out just a 1% change in how you do church, in who you're reaching, in the way you voice the message from Scripture, and stay with that, you're going to end up in a very different place. And maybe it's a 2% or 3% over time. So God has put in every church a next generation that knows how to reach their peers, that speaks the language of that culture. In learning to work with them and doing continual experiments to say, well, let's try this over the summer. Let's try this for a season. you will find a way to be a church like, to use a Canadian illustration, Wayne Gretzky. How do you win so many hockey awards? Well, I don't go to where the puck is. I go to where it's going to be. And likewise, if we can see that the culture is moving towards valuing belonging as one of the many things we've talked about, all right, then let's figure out how to make the church the most belonging place possible and let our younger generations show us how to do that.
Well, that's a good word. The book is called Becoming a Future Ready Church. It's available everywhere you can get books. Highly recommend. Warren, you've mentioned ECFA a few times. You have produced so much research through them, with them. ECFA.org is the place to go?
Is the place to go.
Cool.
The Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, those who are curious.
Awesome. And Adelle, how about you? Where is an easy place to track with you online these days?
You can follow what I write outside of the book at religionnews.com. I work for Religion News Service. I'm the project's editor and national reporter there, have been for just about 30 years now.
That's incredible.
And so you can check out stories there by myself and my colleagues.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Really, really appreciate it. And you helped a lot of leaders today.
Carey, thanks for the privilege. I listen to you. I share your links. I've learned so much. Thank you again.
Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.